Rain had a way of blurring the world into gentler shapes, softening even the coldest corners of the city. And that morning it had washed the streets until they gleamed like onyx under a pale winter sun. She watched from the carriage window as the facades drifted by, balconies strung with iron filigree, windows winking with candlelight, a line of plane trees, leafless and dignified. It should have been a comforting scene, a promise that the world still turned and people still kept their little routines. But every passing landmark felt like a threshold she was being forced to cross. The wheels clattered over cobblestones, and her hands, hidden in kid gloves, held a handkerchief she had no intention of using. She was not crying. She would not cry. She had promised herself that on the first morning she dared to step back into a life that had gone silent for far too long. Her maid had fastened a brooch at her throat before she left, a small oval of mother-of-pearl with a hairline crack that caught the light like lightning held in a shell. For luck, the maid had said, not quite meeting her eyes, as if luck were a door one could open with a pin. She had smiled anyway for the maid's sake, and pinned it where any unkind glance might find it and misunderstand it. People misunderstood so easily. They saw a young woman in a muted gown and thought devotion to grief. They did not see the quieter vows that pressed against her ribs, one breath at a time, one street at a time, one conversation at a time. The carriage slowed. A footman opened the door, and the world poured in. Wet air sweetened with coal smoke, the murmur of many voices, the faint, bright scrape of a violin being tuned behind a set of tall doors. She stepped down with care. The hem of her dress lifted a fraction and felt the ground steady beneath her shoes. A double staircase rose before her, polished to a mirror gleam. Above it, a chandelier hung like a frozen constellation, each crystal catching a private star. The house had been chosen for its spacious rooms and spotless reputation, but she could not shake the feeling that the building itself was watching her entrance with the same curiosity that stirred among the guests. She removed her cloak. The dress beneath was a tempered shade of sea-glass green, a colour agreed upon after many failed mornings in front of the mirror. Colour, yes, her cousin had pleaded, but not so much colour that the city would call it indecent joy. They had settled on something that looked like hope seen through water. The bodice lay modestly, the sleeves tapered into delicate points at her wrists. When she tilted her head, the pearl at her throat blinked and went still. She told her name at the door and watched it ripple through the receiving line. First a polite nod from the host, then a spark in the hostess's eye, then a small hush in the queue behind them, as if her syllables had been a draught that found a seam in the velvet of the morning. She wondered who would risk the first greeting, and whether she still remembered how to answer without being pulled backward into condolences and empty assurances. She wished, briefly and fiercely, for the safety of the garden behind her childhood home, where she used to press her palm to the bark of an apricot tree and pretend she could feel a heartbeat under the moss. Her cousin materialized at her side with the light, efficient grace of a woman who had arranged 1,000 rooms, and meant to arrange one more. "You've done it," the cousin whispered, eyes bright. "That's the worst of it. The first step in, the first breath." She nodded, because any words would have been too large to carry. "Smile if you can," the cousin added softly, and drifted away like a cue in a well-rehearsed play. The music began gently, as if the orchestra were coaxing a bird out of a tree. Conversations rose to a warm hum. She moved through the first small ordeal. The circle of acquaintances who pressed her hand and found the correct, cautious phrases. You look well. How long will you be in town? We must call next week." She answered as an attentive ghost might answer, present, courteous, translucent. Now and then a memory would surface with merciless clarity. The red rim of a teacup on a morning of dreadful news, the way the light had fallen across the rug when the doctor spoke, the last letter she could not bring herself to read a second time. She breathed and let them pass. They were her own, and they were not all she was. The ballroom doors opened and the room unfolded, the long polished floor, the mirrored walls multiplying faces, the soft gold of lamps, the arch of the ceiling like the hull of a ship that had been turned upright to keep the rain at bay. All at once she was aware of how many bodies it takes to make a crowd and how many glances it takes to make a rumour. If she stood very still, she could almost hear the separate layers of sound, the bows skimming strings, the precise footwork of the servants at the edge of sight, the intimate murmurs that ran between friends like wires, crossed and recrossed. Somewhere a woman laughed too brightly. Somewhere a man cleared his throat as if the air had lodged there. She did not see him at first. She saw the effect of his arrival, a small, unmistakable interruption in the drift of conversation, as if the tide had shifted under the dancers' feet. People turned toward the doors, not because the host lifted a hand or the music paused, but because some old habit of attention moved them all at once. Her gaze followed theirs and found him already inside, standing with an ease that did not hide the fact that he was prepared to be unwelcome. He was not ostentatiously handsome. That would have made him easier to dismiss or easier to forgive. He was simply and alarmingly present, tall and spare, the black cut of his coat made elegant by the economy with which he wore it. His hair was too dark for fashion, his jaw drawn in a line that could have been carved or earned, and his eyes, she could not name their colour from across the room, seemed to collect light without giving much of it back. He did not glance at the chandelier or the floor or the faces. He looked forward as though the room had been a book and he meant to read it in order, page by page, without skipping. Her cousin's hand found her arm and tightened. A name, almost a warning, breathed against her ear. It told a brief history. Money made quickly and cleanly in a world that did not do either thing without blood. A first marriage that ended in a grave with questions laid on top like stones. A habit of winning bargains that other men believed could not be won. A preference for solitude mistaken, as it often is, for cruelty. The city had played telephone with his life until it rang under every roof. Children had been dared to point out his townhouse. Women had declared they would accept his invitation only to assure their friends they would not. He began to walk. He did not move quickly or slowly. He moved at a speed that required the room to adjust. People stepped aside the way one steps for a memory that refuses to be mislaid. The music continued its unhurried sweep, but the beat inside her changed. She did not know why she was suddenly certain of the line he would take, why she could feel it like a string pulled taut between 2 points that had never met. She thought of leaving. She thought, just as quickly and with something like alarm, of staying very still and seeing whether a strange certainty could be trusted. He stopped in front of her as if the floor had decided that place was best. Up close she saw that his eyes were grey, not dull grey, but the colour of a sea before a storm has committed itself. There was a tiredness at the corners of his mouth that did not read as weakness, and a reserve that was not indifference. Someone like him could have opened with a compliment. He did not. He said her name with a question folded into the shape of a statement, and when she inclined her head in confirmation, he spoke the next sentence as if he had been rehearsing it not for days, but for years. Would she permit the first dance? She should have refused. There are refusals that make social sense, that let the air out of a dangerous moment without wounding anyone's dignity. She had practiced several of them in her mind, the way one practices exits from burning rooms. But the word that left her mouth was not no, or even perhaps. It was yes, shaped by a breath that belonged equally to fear and to something larger than fear, something more impatient, more alive. She took his hand and felt beneath the signet ring and the immaculate glove the heat of a palm that had held difficult days and did not tremble now. The orchestra shifted into a waltz that must have been chosen by a woman who understood mercy, simple, stately, with turns that did not mock the hesitant. He did not pull her. He invited motion, and she found it. Their first circle was careful, each of them weighing the other's balance like strangers exchanging names in a language not fully shared. By the second turn, he had adjusted to the fraction of a second she needed before every step. By the third, she realized he had noticed the way her breath shortened when she was looked at too long and had arranged their trajectory to keep them in the quieter side of the floor. "You are brave," he said at last. The words pitched for her, and only her. The voice matched him, steady, unhurried, the timbre of a man who spent more words in his head than he let out. Or reckless. "I am present," she answered, surprised at the reply and at the steadiness of her own tone. "Some days that is the most a person can be." "Presence frightens people more than absence," he said, almost to himself. "One can be kind to the memory of a woman. It is harder to be kind to her when she returns and refuses to match the portrait." She felt a laugh rise and did not release it. "You speak as if you have been misremembered." "I have been rewritten," he said, and even in the lightness of the dance she heard something like fatigue shift beneath the boards. "But that is not interesting talk for a ballroom." "It is the only interesting talk for a ballroom," she said before she could stop herself, and felt the smallest, swiftest echo of humour move through him like a ripple in glass. They passed a mirror, and she caught their outline pressed into a frame of gilt, her dress like a muted wave, his coat like deliberate shadow, the two of them joined by the simple insistence of hands. The image startled her, not because they looked good together, she did not think like that, but because they looked possible. She had not allowed that word to touch her in a very long time. Possibility was for other people, for girls who had not watched the doctor fasten his bag and leave in quiet defeat, for women who had not learned the winter months by the names of sickness and silence. So yet there she was, turning without dizziness, standing without apology in the ordinary miracle of being one person among many. They moved through a figure that required proximity and conversation, both. He asked a question that was not about weather or travel or music. If she missed the mornings in the country when the first sound is birds and the second is a kettle, the specificity of it nearly undid her. She said yes, because the question deserved no embroidery. He asked carefully what she read. She told him the last book she had finished, and the sentence she had circled in pencil, because it made her feel seen by someone who had died 200 years before. He nodded, as if that were a perfectly rational way to be known. "You have been quiet for a long time," he said after a moment. "Not inside," she said. "I spoke to myself so often, I had to forgive each conversation twice." She had not intended to say that. The line was too intimate for a dance floor, too tender to have survived the public air, and yet it had crossed. She waited for the sting of regret, and it did not come. He did not offer sympathy. He acknowledged. "Then the outside will need time to catch up," he said. "It usually lags behind what we already are." The music came to its measured end with a chord that left the air briefly clearer, as if someone had wiped a window. They stopped. He bowed. She curtsied. Applause fluttered like paper birds and fell. When she straightened, she understood that something irreversible had occurred, not in the room, but in her. She would not be able to pretend after this that she had re-entered society as a formality performed for the benefit of relatives and neighbors. She had arrived as herself, and that self had been witnessed by a man who was not in the habit of witnessing lightly. He asked if she would rest. She agreed because her heart, an organ that had done its duty without asking for portions of happiness, had decided to be frankly alive and needed a bench to do it on. He offered his arm, and the small court of onlookers performed their part, some with frank curiosity, some with a careful blankness that meant envy, some with the reserved calculation of people who hear the gears of gossip align and prepare to be spun. The bench was mercifully near a window cracked open an inch. Cool air slid along her skin like a reprimand that felt like grace. He did not sit too close. He did not stand over her. He found a way to occupy the space beside her without touching it. "May I say something unfashionable?" he asked, and she gave the smallest nod. "You looked exactly yourself when you walked in. It is rarer than beauty, and more difficult to hold. If I had not asked you to dance, I would have been a coward twice." "You assume I would have accepted," she said, and felt the corner of her mouth warm despite herself. "I assume you would have accepted if you wished to," he corrected, "and that is the only reason worth asking." She turned her face toward the window and watched a drop of water gather under the sash until its weight pulled it free and it fell into the night. "People will say things," she said. "They will make their old stories fit today's angles." "They will," he agreed. "And yet the room is not as powerful as it believes. It will forget us by noon, faced with the next scandal or the next gown. What it cannot forget is a person who insists on belonging to herself. It will try to punish her. It will fail if she does not assist it." She thought of all the ways she had assisted the world in diminishing her. Small silences acquiesced to, invitations declined before they were even extended, the reflex of apology. The idea that refusal could be an act of allegiance to herself had not occurred to her when she was busy learning the choreography of grief. "I have no talent for spectacle," she said, and surprised herself again by how much steadier her voice sounded when she told a truth without decoration. "Nor I," he said. "I only have the habit of refusing to be instructed by whispers. It has not made me pleasant company, but it has kept me intact." A woman in a feathered turban glanced at them, stage whispered into her companion's ear, and then giggled in the brittle way that announces a performance for an audience of 2.5 She looked away, not because she was ashamed, as she might have been a year ago, but because the movement cost less than contempt and purchased the same peace. A servant approached with a silver tray. He took 2 glasses and set one gently beside her. She did not drink. He did not insist. He studied the small map of condensation that bloomed under the base of his glass and said, without looking up, "There is a house I rarely open. My sister keeps a winter garden in one of the rooms because she believes plants, like people, do better when they are given one corner that belongs only to them. Would you forgive the boldness? Consider visiting that garden one afternoon. She would be glad of the company. She is less fragile than people imagine, and more lonely than she deserves. It was the oddest invitation she had ever received, the honest admission of boldness, the acknowledgement that the visit was for more than flowers, the interposed sister, like a lantern, set between two travellers meeting at dusk. Everything in it could be read 100 ways, and she had no desire to read it any way but the simplest. "Yes," she said, because a corner that belonged to her was a sentence she had not dared to write in her own house, and because the person asking seemed to understand the weight of the ask. He stood at once, relieved and as composed as if nothing had depended on her answer. "Tomorrow at 3, he said. "If the weather does not threaten to drown the city, if it does, then the day after. A garden prefers honest rain to polite schedules." She rose too, because sitting when the world had just widened felt like ingratitude. "Tomorrow," she said, "at 3. A violinist took a risk on an aria that asked the room for more hush than it could spare. People drifted toward the refreshment tables like birds adjusting to a change in wind. Her cousin reappeared with an expression that combined triumph and interrogation, and would soon, she knew, require diplomacy over tea. For the moment, she decided to be unreasonable and keep one small thing to herself, the exact way her palm had remembered its life when it rested in his, the precise relief of being addressed as if her mind were a place worth entering without muddy boots. Outside, the rain had gentled to a mist that seemed to lift from the ground rather than fall to it. Carriages came and went in a choreography older than any rumour. She put on her cloak, pinched the brooch between finger and thumb until it stung, and allowed herself, just this once, to wonder what it would be like to stand in a room where she was neither grieving nor fled, neither observed nor instructing herself to be smaller. A room where a plant and a person were permitted to grow toward a window without someone tying them back. By the time she reached the carriage, the faintest laugh had found its way to the back of her throat. A laugh with no audience intended, the kind that lives only in the body that makes it. The driver tipped his hat. She stepped up and in, and sat with her hands open on her lap, as if she trusted them now to carry the day without crushing it. When the wheels turned, the city unspooled not as a net, but as a road. The house she had left behind was still buzzing with guesses. The house she would visit tomorrow was an unopened book. Between the two, she was, finally and undeniably, herself. And that recognition felt like the first warm thing after winter. Not a blaze, not a trumpet, just a steady, tender heat that promised it knew how to keep going. The morning after the ball dawned grey and hesitant, as if the city itself were undecided whether to bless her courage or punish her recklessness. She had slept little. Every time she closed her eyes, the memory of the waltz returned with startling clarity, the weight of his hand, the steady rhythm that had steadied her in return, the way his gaze had cut through the blur of chandeliers and whispers until it seemed she stood in a room inhabited by no one but him. She pressed her palm against her chest as if to quiet the echo of the music still vibrating there. Her cousin chattered over breakfast, alternating between triumph and alarm. "You realize what you've done," she said, pouring tea with unnecessary force. "You've drawn the notice of a man who never dances and rarely speaks. Half the city will invent stories before luncheon." Augusta stirred honey into her cup and pretended composure. "Let them invent," she said quietly. "They have invented worse about both of us before." But even as she spoke, a thread of unease pulled at her. Attention was a currency she had no wish to spend, yet she had accepted his invitation, and something within her knew it had not been a trivial gesture. By mid-afternoon, her carriage carried her toward the Duke's residence, its austere facade looming like a sentinel over Berkeley Square. She had rehearsed excuses a dozen times, telling herself she could decline, she could beg fatigue, she could send a polite note. Yet each excuse withered before the memory of his eyes and the strange conviction that if she refused, she would be turning her back on something larger than propriety. The butler received her as if she had been expected all her life. Inside, the halls were lined with portraits whose stern gazes followed her, men and women carved in the same angular mould, their eyes a gallery of judgment. When the drawing-room doors opened, she was greeted not by the Duke, but by his sister. Eleanor was younger, fragile in appearance, yet radiant in manner, and she reached for Augusta with a warmth that disarmed every defense. "I am so glad you came," she said, her voice like a bell struck softly. In her presence, Augusta's tension loosened. They sat among flowers and porcelain, speaking of books and music, of childhood gardens, and the quiet solace of solitude. Augusta discovered in Eleanor a kindred gentleness, a reminder that not all Cavendishes were forged of iron. And then he entered. He did not stride this time as he had in the ballroom. He paused at the threshold, allowing the sunlight from the corridor to outline his figure before he approached. "Lady Augusta," he said, bowing slightly, his voice carrying both gravity and something almost unguarded. She rose, curtsied, and met his gaze with as much steadiness as she could muster. Eleanor teased him for his bluntness, and Augusta found herself smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time in months. The conversation shifted like a tide. Light banter between sisters, careful probes between strangers, sudden moments of candor that startled her with their intimacy. He asked if she feared him. She answered with honesty that she had faced enough loss to leave little room for fear. Something flickered across his face, a recognition that made the air between them taut. When he invited her to dinner the following evening, she heard herself accept before reason could intervene. That night, alone in her chamber, she turned the events over in her mind like a set of polished stones, each smooth and dangerous. She recalled the whispers of the guests, the calculating glances, the knowledge that every step she took in his company bound her to his reputation, whether for ruin or for redemption. Yet beneath the weight of caution pulsed a deeper truth. For the first time since widowhood had wrapped her in silence, she felt the stirrings of life again. Not merely survival, not mere endurance, but the perilous, exhilarating possibility of being truly seen. And with that recognition came a question she had not dared to ask herself in years. Could she learn to love again, not as a duty, not as a shield, but as a choice? The answer trembled on the edge of her heart, unspoken, waiting for the days to come. The dinner at Shadowmere House was unlike any gathering Augusta had ever endured or enjoyed. She had expected grandeur, perhaps intimidation. Instead, she found an intimacy sharpened by tension, as if each guest had been invited not merely to dine, but to play a role in a drama already underway. 8 people at the table, each bearing a different mask. At the Duke's right hand she was displayed like a prize, the seat of honour that carried with it scrutiny sharper than any dagger. Candles flickered along the polished length of the table, their flames mirrored in the silverware, the glasses, the watchful eyes of strangers. The first course was simple, almost austere. Soup laced with herbs that perfumed the air. She barely tasted it, her attention pulled by the weight of the gazes upon her. To her left, Lord Harrington and his wife spoke with genuine warmth, offering gentle remarks that soothed her raw nerves. Opposite her sat Sir William Preston and his wife Henrietta, and Augusta felt at once the prickle of calculation, the faint scent of malice disguised as courtesy. The Duke himself spoke little, but every word he offered had the effect of silencing the rest. When Sir William suggested that women ought to concern themselves with embroidery rather than estates, Alexander cut him off with quiet authority. Lady Augusta manages her affairs with a skill many men might envy. The increase in yield at Hadley is evidence enough. Augusta nearly dropped her spoon. She had never told him those figures. How did he know? His eyes met hers briefly, unreadable, before sliding away. Course followed course. Lord Blackwood leaned across the table with two bright eyes, pressing his attentions with the eagerness of a man who mistook persistence for charm. Eleanor, radiant despite her fragile health, steered the conversation toward music, books, flowers, subjects that offered Augusta safe harbour. Yet always she felt the Duke's awareness like a current beneath the surface, tugging her gaze back whenever she strayed too long in another direction. After the meal, when Eleanor coaxed her guests into the music room, Augusta welcomed the chance to escape. She stood at the balcony for a breath of cool air, the moonlight tracing silver along the balustrade. And then he was beside her, his presence unmistakable even before he spoke. "You are overwhelmed," he said, not unkindly. "Your company is formidable," she replied, unwilling to yield more than that. He studied the garden, its shadows deepened by the lantern light. Every man at that table came with an agenda. "Sir William, Blackwood, Everley, they see you as leverage. You must be careful." Her pulse quickened. "And what of you, Your Grace? Do you see me as leverage too?" His head turned, eyes glinting like steel caught in moonlight. "I see you as a woman who stands her ground when others would retreat. That is not leverage. That is rarity." Before she could respond, Lord Blackwood appeared, eager and smiling, offering to escort her to the conservatory. She accepted, though she felt the Duke's gaze follow like a silent tether. Among the orchids, Blackwood's charm cracked into desperation. He confessed admiration, hinted at schemes, even dared to take her hand. Yet the moment soured when Dr. Bennet appeared, stern and cautious, warning her in low tones that not all men were what they seemed, including perhaps her host. His words pressed against her thoughts like cold fingers, and by the time she returned to the ballroom, Augusta's mind swirled with doubts. The evening spun onward, music, laughter, whispers edged with venom. Lady Preston drifted close, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, implying that Alexander's first wife had died in fear, that Augusta was merely the next to be ensnared. Augusta deflected with dignity, but inside the words lodged like shards. Was she walking willingly into ruin, or into something even more dangerous, the possibility of trust? When at last the carriage bore her away, her cousin's eyes shone with both excitement and alarm. "He is captivated," Catherine whispered fiercely. "But be warned, Augusta. Captivation by a man such as that can destroy as easily as it can save. Augusta leaned back against the cushions, her fingers pressed to the locket at her throat. She should feel only dread. She should retreat into safety, close her doors, return to solitude. And yet, her heart betrayed her. For the first time in years, it beat not only to survive, but to know, to risk, to live. And beneath the roar of caution, a quieter thought stirred, fragile but insistent. Perhaps she had already chosen her path the moment she placed her hand in his for that first waltz. The charity ball was a tempest wrapped in silk and candlelight, and Augusta felt herself caught in its eye. For weeks she and Eleanor had laboured over details, the invitations, the decorations, the arrangements that would soothe the city into remembering its generosity rather than its scandals. Yet when the carriages began to arrive, and the grand hall of Shadowmere House blazed with music and jewels, Augusta realized that no amount of planning could shield her from the scrutiny that now converged upon her. She was no longer merely a widow returning from seclusion. She was the woman who stood beside the Duke of Shadowmere, the woman whispered about in every drawing-room and coffee-house. Alexander greeted their guests with impeccable courtesy, but his hand lingered over hers as he presented her as co-hostess, and that single gesture spoke louder than all his words. Surprise flickered across faces, speculation darkened others. Lady Preston's gaze, sharp as a dagger, slid over Augusta with undisguised contempt. Lord Eveleigh bent low with a smile too practised, too knowing. Even Lord Blackwood, flushed with wine, seemed emboldened to press closer than before. Augusta felt as if she had been thrust onto a stage where every gesture, every word, would be dissected for meaning. The night unfolded in a blur of waltzes and whispers. She danced first with Lord Harrington, whose gentle humour provided a welcome respite. Then with Dr. Bennet, who observed her with the solemn concern of a man who knew more than he could safely say. At every turn she sensed Alexander watching, not with the indulgence of a suitor, but with the vigilance of a commander guarding a battle line. He had warned her to trust no one completely. She found herself wondering if that warning had included himself. It was Lady Preston who struck first, gliding to Augusta's side with a smile polished to perfection. Her words dripped poison sweetly disguised, insinuations about Alexander's first wife, suggestions that Augusta was following the same doomed path. Augusta met each barb with poise, but the insinuations clung like cobwebs. Before she could shake them off, Alexander himself intervened, his tone colder than steel, dismissing Lady Preston with a glance that would have frozen a lesser woman. Yet Augusta's composure had been tested. Beneath her calm exterior, doubt gnawed like a hidden worm. The tension reached a breaking point when Lord Blackwood, flushed with drink and desperation, caused a scene so loud that Augusta, fearing a scandal, drew him away to the library. There, his mask slipped entirely. He accused Alexander of ruin, of murder, of secrets darker than gossip dared name. His words fell heavy as stones, and though Augusta resisted them, doubt coiled tighter around her heart. Alexander entered before the confrontation could end, his presence filling the room with thunderous silence. He dismissed Blackwood with icy contempt, but Augusta could not banish the echo of his rival's accusations. Then came the collapse. Lady Preston fell suddenly ill, her crimson gown a splash of drama against the polished floor. Whispers surged like wildfire, poison, scandal, suspicion, and somehow Augusta's name threaded through them all. Evely claimed to have seen her with Henrietta moments before, to have noted her disappearance with Blackwood. The accusations were veiled but sharp, and Augusta felt the chill of isolation close in. Alexander's defence was swift and firm, yet even his authority could not entirely stem the tide of rumour. As if fate conspired to tighten the snare, Blackwood himself was later discovered unconscious in the garden, a note pinned to his coat. The widow danced with death. Now death claims another. The words struck Augusta like a curse, her breath stolen by the implication that she was at the centre of a plot darker than she had imagined. Alexander's expression hardened to steel. He insisted she must leave London at once, for her safety, for her name, for their fragile hope of a future. Augusta's heart rebelled at the thought of retreat. To leave now would be to admit guilt, to yield to those who sought to destroy her. Yet as Alexander's grip closed around her hands, urgent and almost desperate, she saw in his eyes something she had never expected. Fear. Not fear for himself, but fear for her. That vulnerability pierced her defences more deeply than any declaration of passion could have. For the first time, the Duke of Shadowmere revealed not just his power, but his peril. Later, in the dim quiet of the library, he gave her a gift, a locket, delicate and golden, engraved with roses whose stems intertwined like fates bound by choice rather than chance. Inside was not a portrait, but a simple note in his bold hand. Where shadows end, light begins. Trust in that light, as I have learned to trust in you. The words stole her breath, dissolving the last remnants of her doubt. She realized with trembling certainty that whatever danger lay ahead, whatever schemes surrounded them, she had already stepped beyond the point of no return. When his lips finally brushed hers, gentle yet unyielding, it was less a kiss than a vow, a sealing of unspoken promises. She surrendered to it not as a woman dazzled by romance, but as one who recognized the perilous gift of truth in a world built on deceit. And when he urged her to go, to hide until the storm had passed, she agreed, not because she feared the whispers, but because she understood that their story was only beginning, and survival was the first chapter they must write together. As her carriage carried her through the sleeping city hours later, Augusta touched the locket at her throat and closed her eyes. She was no longer the trembling widow who had stepped hesitantly into a ballroom weeks before. She was a woman walking willingly into shadow, trusting that somewhere beyond its edges waited a light fierce enough to change everything. Autumn unfurled its cloak across the hills of Derbyshire, painting the slopes in hues of amber, russet, and gold. Morning mist clung to the valleys, curling through the hedgerows like secrets reluctant to be told. At Rosewood Cottage, the small sanctuary her mother had once adored, Augusta stood at the narrow window, her fingers resting against the cool pane, her eyes straining toward the winding road that cut through the hills. It had been 3 months since she fled London beneath the cloak of secrecy, 3 months since the chaos of the charity ball and the shadows it cast across her name. 3 months since Alexander Cavendish had pressed a golden locket into her hand and promised, "Where shadows end, light begins." Every day since, she had touched that locket, as if the weight of it could anchor her against solitude and doubt. The days were long, but not barren. She oversaw the cottage gardens, wrote letters to Eleanor, rode along the quiet lanes with only her maid for company. She forced herself to keep busy, yet beneath each task pulsed an ache of anticipation, a constant wondering whether the Duke's promise would withstand the slow erosion of time. Then came the letter, delivered by a trusted messenger, sealed with his bold hand. She had read it once, then again and again, until she knew each word by heart. Preston had been undone, his schemes exposed. Blackwood had spoken truth at last, testifying against his own accomplice, and the threads of conspiracy had finally unravelled. "I ride for Derbyshire on Wednesday," Alexander had written. "By week's end I shall stand before you, not as a man encumbered by scandal, but as one who has fought through shadow to reach the light you once promised me. Until then, I remain yours in earnest anticipation." Now Saturday dawned, and with it a storm of hope and dread. For what if absence had dimmed his feelings? What if their bond, forged in peril, proved fragile in peace? She pressed her forehead to the glass, whispering a prayer too tender to share even with herself. Hoofbeats broke the silence, steady, sure, echoing up the valley road. Her heart leapt into her throat. She saw him then, a solitary rider upon a black stallion, his figure unmistakable even at a distance. Upright, resolute, cut against the pale autumn light, like a figure from a half-remembered dream. The world blurred around him. He was the only shape that mattered. When at last he stood in the doorway, travel-worn yet unbowed, Augusta felt time collapse. His coat was dusted with the road, his cravat loosened, but his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, burned with a warmth she had not dared to imagine. "Lady Augusta," he said, and the room itself seemed to exhale. She answered with composure she did not feel. "Your Grace." Yet, in the silence between those words, something deeper stirred. Recognition, belonging, inevitability. He closed the distance in 3 strides, and then he was before her, so close she could feel the heat of him, smell the leather and smoke of his journey. For a moment neither spoke. Then, with a quiet ferocity, he said, "3 months is an intolerably long time." She felt her lips curve despite her trembling. "Interminable," she agreed, and just like that, the long exile ended. They sat together by the fire, the warmth of the flames competing with the warmth of their gazes. He confessed what she had long suspected, that he had practiced 100 speeches on the road, each more eloquent than the last, and now found them useless. "Perhaps," she whispered, "simplicity will serve better than eloquence." And so he told her, plainly and without artifice, that he loved her, that he had begun to love her the moment she walked into the ballroom, trembling yet unbroken, that what began as strategy had become salvation, that he could not imagine a life in which she did not stand at his side. From his pocket he drew a small velvet box. Inside gleamed a sapphire circled with diamonds, the stone catching the firelight like captured twilight. "Augusta Blackwell," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor at its edge, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not for land, nor title, nor advantage, but because you are my equal, my partner, my light after long darkness?" Tears blurred her vision. She thought of all that had passed, the whispers, the threats, the dangers, and knew that every shadow had led her to this moment. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." joy transformed him, banishing years of severity in a single smile. He slid the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms, kissing her with a reverence that stole her breath. The kiss deepened, fierce with all the months of longing they had endured, and when at last they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, whispering, "Now I am whole." The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation, yet unlike the charity ball, this was no performance for society. Their wedding was planned for Christmas Eve, a small ceremony at Shadowmere Chapel, attended only by those they trusted. Eleanor, radiant and stronger than Augusta had ever seen her, insisted on arranging flowers herself. Catherine wept openly, declaring she had never schemed for such a match, yet was delighted by its outcome. Even Blackwood, chastened and altered by his brush with ruin, accepted an invitation, offering a hand of reconciliation that astonished them all. When the day arrived, snow lay thick across the grounds, transforming Shadowmere into a realm of crystal and light. Augusta walked the aisle in ivory silk, embroidered with silver thread, her hair crowned with roses and holly. Alexander waited at the altar, his expression undone by awe, as if he still could not believe this day was real. Their vows were spoken with clear voices, steady and unshaken, and when he placed the wedding band beside her sapphire, the once feared Duke of Shadowmere trembled like any man overwhelmed by love. As they stepped from the chapel into the bright winter sun, rose petals and laughter rained upon them. Alexander bent close and murmured, "Happy, Your Grace?" She smiled through tears. "Completely, though I believe true happiness is not a destination, but a journey shared." His grey eyes shone with promise. "Then let us begin that journey, my love. Step by step, day by day, from this moment forward." Hand in hand, they walked through the snow toward Shadowmere House, no longer shadows of their former selves, but companions bound by light. Augusta knew then with unshakable certainty that the trembling widow who had once feared the judgment of society had found at last not only love, but a life worth every risk. And the Duke who had been whispered about as a monster had revealed himself as a man capable of the greatest courage of all, to trust, to hope, to love. Their story, once woven of secrets and suspicion, had become a testament to resilience. For sometimes the most unexpected waltz leads to the most extraordinary journey, and the most feared man may prove to be the most beloved husband